Look at a map of Australia from the air, not the coastline, the interior. What you are looking at is one of the most hostile landmasses on the planet. 70% of the continent is classified as arid or semi-arid. The annual rainfall across most of the interior averages less than 250 millimeters. The soil is ancient, geologically exhausted, leached of nutrients over hundreds of millions of years. There are no great navigable rivers feeding an agricultural heartland. No Mississippi, no Nile, no Rhine. The Murray-Darling system, the closest Australia has to a river network, is chronically stressed and politically contested. By every metric that has historically predicted national wealth, Australia should be poor. The continent sits at the bottom of the world, thousands of kilometres from the nearest major market. It has no land borders, no strategic choke points to tax, no feudal agricultural tradition that was converted into industrial capital. It was colonised late by a nation that used it initially as a prison. In 1788, the British government sent convicted criminals to the least valuable corner of the planet they could find. That is the starting point. And yet, Australia today has one of the highest GDP per capita figures on Earth. Approximately $65,000 per person, consistently placing it inside the top 10 globally. Its citizens live longer, on average, than almost any other population. Its currency is freely traded. Its bond market is considered one of the most stable in the world. Its banking system survived the 2008 global financial crisis without a single major institution failing or requiring a government bailout. A continent that should be poor is, by almost every measurable standard, extraordinarily wealthy. The question worth asking is not just how. The question is whether the wealth works the way you think it does, and whether it works for the people who actually live there. Because the answer is more complicated and more deliberately structured than the story Australia tells about itself. In 1964, an Australian journalist named Donald Horne published a book called The Lucky Country. Most Australians know the phrase. Almost none of them know what Horne actually meant by it. The opening line of the relevant passage reads, "Australia is a lucky country, run by second-rate people who share its luck." Horne was not celebrating Australia. He was criticising it. His argument was that Australia had become prosperous not through innovation, institutional excellence, or strategic foresight, but through the accident of sitting on top of extraordinary natural resource deposits at the precise historical moment when the industrializing world needed them most. Lucky. Not clever. Lucky. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in understanding how Australian wealth actually works. Here is the mechanism. Australia sits on one of the most mineral-dense geological formations on the planet. The Pilbara region of Western Australia contains iron ore reserves of such quantity and quality that they reshaped global steel production in the second half of the 20th century. The Bowen Basin in Queensland holds some of the world's largest deposits of metallurgical coal. The Cooper Basin produces natural gas. The Goldfields region of Western Australia has been exporting gold continuously since the 1890s. And beneath all of it, in formations still being mapped, lie deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements, the raw materials of the 21st century energy transition. Australia does not manufacture the products that use these materials. It extracts the materials and ships them, predominantly to one customer. In the financial year 2022 to 2023, Australia exported approximately 265 billion Australian dollars worth of goods and services to China. That is roughly a third of all Australian exports going to a single country. Iron ore alone, the red rock dug out of the Pilbara and loaded onto bulk carriers, accounts for the majority of that figure. The rise of Chinese manufacturing from the 1990s onward did not create Australian wealth, but it turbocharged it at a scale and speed that no other factor could have replicated. For 30 years, from 1991 to 2020, Australia recorded uninterrupted GDP growth, the longest streak of any developed economy in modern history. No recession, no contraction. 30 years. The economics community called it the miracle economy. Horne would have called it lucky timing. Because what underpinned those 30 years was not productivity growth, or technological innovation, or educational excellence. It was the fact that the country sitting on the world's most valuable dirt happened to be located 12 hours by sea from the world's fastest growing manufacturer. This is the first mechanism. We call it the resource floor, a baseline of wealth so deep and so geologically guaranteed that it provides structural insulation against almost any policy mistake a government might make. Australia has made many policy mistakes. The resource floor absorbed them. But here is where the story stops being about luck and starts being about architecture. because the wealth generated by the resource floor does not distribute itself evenly. It never has, and the systems built around it were not designed to make it do so. Start with the geography of extraction. The minerals are in Western Australia, Queensland, and the Northern Territory. The management of the companies extracting those minerals is in Sydney and Melbourne. The financial services that fund the extraction are in Sydney and Melbourne. The legal firms that structure the contracts are in Sydney and Melbourne. The superannuation funds that hold the equity in the mining companies and collect the dividends are managed from Sydney and Melbourne. The dirt is in the west. The wealth flows east. This is not accidental. It is the product of capital gravity. The same mechanism described in the previous video in this series. Federal investment, corporate headquarters, financial infrastructure, and regulatory power all concentrate in existing centres. The resources are extracted from the periphery. The returns accumulate at the core. Western Australia generates more mineral royalties than any jurisdiction in the Southern Hemisphere. Under Australia's horizontal fiscal equalisation system, it has historically received back substantially less than it contributes in per capita federal funding. At the lowest point, Western Australia received approximately 30 cents for every dollar of GST revenue it generated. The continent produces the wealth. The system decides where the wealth lives. Now look at the second mechanism. We call it the superannuation capture. In 1992, the Australian government introduced compulsory superannuation, a mandatory retirement savings system that requires employers to contribute a percentage of every worker's salary into a managed fund. That percentage is currently 11% and rising. The intention was to reduce future dependence on the age pension. The effect was something else entirely. Australia's superannuation system now holds approximately 3.9 trillion Australian dollars in assets, one of the largest pools of managed capital relative to GDP anywhere on Earth. Those funds are managed by a relatively small number of large institutions, concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne, investing predominantly in Australian equities, Australian property, and Australian financial instruments. The compulsory savings of every working Australian flow into a centralised pool. That pool is then deployed back into the same concentrated urban economy, into the banks, the property market, the infrastructure of the two cities that already hold the majority of the population. Every Australian is saving for retirement. The system through which those savings flow reinforces the very concentration of wealth that makes retirement in Sydney or Melbourne increasingly difficult to afford. This is not conspiracy. It is architecture. And architecture, unlike conspiracy, does not require ongoing coordination to keep running. The third mechanism is the one most Australians live inside without recognising it. We call it the housing conversion. Australian residential property has a total estimated value of approximately 10 trillion Australian dollars, roughly 5 times the country's annual GDP. That ratio is among the highest in the developed world. In most economies, housing is accommodation. In Australia, housing became the primary vehicle through which the middle class participates in the wealth generated by the resource economy. The channel works as follows. Resource wealth inflates wages and asset prices. Asset price inflation concentrates in the two cities where the management class lives. Property in those cities appreciates. The owning class builds wealth through appreciation. The renting class pays the owning class for access to the accommodation the owning class bought earlier. Housing in Australia is not just shelter. It is the mechanism through which the lucky country distributes its luck, selectively, to those who arrived early enough to buy into the system before the price became prohibitive. The Productivity Commission identified this in 2017. The Reserve Bank has flagged it repeatedly. The OECD has noted that Australian intergenerational wealth transfer through housing is among the highest in the developed world, meaning that what your parents own is an increasingly significant predictor of your lifetime financial position. Donald Horne said Australia was lucky. What he could not have anticipated was that the luck would eventually become structured, that the systems built around it would determine with increasing precision whose luck it actually was. Here is what the architecture produces in practice. In 2026, Australia's GDP per capita is approximately $65,000 US. That number is real. It is also, in a critical sense, misleading, because GDP per capita is a mean, not a median, and the distribution of Australian wealth has been compressing upward for 2 decades. The bottom 40% of Australian households hold approximately 3% of the country's net wealth. The top 10% hold approximately 47%, a country with a GDP per capita in the global top 10. A bottom 40% with a wealth share of 3%. The resource floor made the country rich. The superannuation capture centralised where the savings go. The housing conversion determined who benefits from the asset inflation that results. And underneath all three mechanisms sits a structural fact that rarely appears in the narrative Australia tells about itself. Australia has no globally significant technology company. No Australian firm appears in the global top 100 by market capitalisation. The country has produced world-class researchers, engineers, and entrepreneurs, many of whom now work at companies headquartered in San Francisco, London, or Singapore. This is not coincidence. It is the predictable output of an economy structured around extraction rather than creation. When the resource floor provides structural insulation against the consequences of poor productivity, the incentive to build globally competitive industries is diminished. Why develop the next Atlassian when the Pilbara keeps delivering? Atlassian, incidentally, was founded by two Australians, built in Australia, and is now headquartered in the United States. Its founders are billionaires. Australia counts them among its success stories. The company's tax domicile is elsewhere. This is the lucky country running its standard operating procedure. The resource wealth flows. The management class captures the returns. The compulsory savings of the working population are recycled into the system. The property market converts asset inflation into intergenerational advantage. And the continent keeps producing the raw materials that the rest of the world turns into the products Australians import. The 33-year growth streak ended in 2020 with the COVID pandemic. It resumed, but the structural questions it exposed did not disappear with the recovery. What happens when China's demand for iron ore declines? As its construction cycle matures and its own domestic resources develop? What happens when the energy transition reduces demand for metallurgical coal? What happens when the resource floor, which has absorbed every policy mistake for 30 years, begins to thin? The Productivity Commission has asked these questions. Infrastructure Australia has modelled the answers. The reports have been filed. Here is what Donald Horne understood in 1964 that the lucky country has spent 60 years avoiding. Luck is not a strategy, it is a starting condition. The countries that converted resource wealth into durable prosperity, Norway with its sovereign wealth fund, Singapore with its institutional investment in human capital, South Korea with its deliberate industrial policy, made decisions. Difficult, politically contested, generationally consequential decisions about where the wealth would go and what it would build. Australia made a different decision. It built a system that recycled the luck back into the existing structure, into the two cities, the property market, the financial institutions, the superannuation funds, and called the result prosperity. For most of the people living in it, it has been prosperous. The quality of life in Sydney and Melbourne is, by global standards, remarkable. The hospitals work, the schools function, the streets are safe. The coffee is excellent, but the luck was always finite. The geological deposits do not replenish. The Chinese construction cycle will not run forever. The property market cannot appreciate faster than incomes indefinitely without eventually breaking the social contract that holds the system together. The continent became rich on luck, the question that was never seriously asked, and that the architecture of the system was specifically designed to avoid asking, is what the luck was for. Whether it was for building something that lasts, or simply for running, as long as it runs.